are the industries that are profitable enough to pay decent wages, to pay family wage jobs that are not susceptible to the jobs being shipped out of the country. And since only 30% of the jobs in America require a college degree, the way to focus that question, the really most important question, is where are there jobs like that are available to people that could be decently paid jobs for people without college degrees? For more than 100 years, the most important answer to that question has been the auto industry. Auto manufacturing is the single biggest manufacturing industry in the country, with over 1 million jobs. And these have been good jobs, particularly union jobs. Union auto jobs pay workers without a college degree an average of $21 an hour, which is 30% more than the average paid in the whole rest of the economy for people without a college degree. One of the reasons that auto jobs have been such good jobs is because it's been a highly unionized sector. But in the next 10 years, as this is obviously what we're here to talk about, the industry is on the brink of a fundamental transition from gasoline powered to electric vehicles. And the question is whether the jobs that come up in the electric vehicle industry will continue to be good jobs that you can support a family on or not. And a lot of that has to do with unionization. If you look nationally at national average across the country and across industries, if you look at two people who both have the same education, same experience in the same occupation, in the same industry, but one has a union and one doesn't, the person with the union on average makes about 10% more in wages. And depending on how you measure it, has between 25 and 50% better chance of getting health insurance and a pension through their job. So it's not surprising that a lot of people want to have a union. The most recent survey data, which came out of MIT, let me just, according to the most recent survey data from MIT, there are 58 million American workers who work in non-union workplaces who say they wish they had a union in their workplace. And the shocking thing is that only 50,000 people a year, by comparison, or less than 1% of that 58 million, actually succeed in getting a new union through the National Labor Relations Board, which is the federal agency that has the power to conduct elections in the workplace for people who want to form a union. So the key question that we have to look at in thinking about can people, can electric vehicles or other industries be family wage jobs and be union jobs is why do less than 1% of the people who want a union are they able to get one? When people hear that there's such a thing called union elections, everybody assumes that these must work basically the same as all the other elections that we're familiar with, whether it's elections to Congress, elections to city council, or anything else we know. And unfortunately, nothing could be further from the truth. What this slide shows is that on almost every dimension of how America defines democratic elections, what is illegal in federal elections is legal and commonplace in elections in the workplace. And that when you put all this together, in fact, elections conducted by the Labor Board, which is the process workers have to go through in order to try to create a union under federal labor law, looks unlike any American elections that we're used to, and more like the discredited elections in like those rogue regimes in other countries where the ruling party gets 98% of the vote. There's a lot of different dimensions to this, but I want to today just talk about the issue of free speech. It's fundamental in American democracy, obviously, that in an election, both candidates and voters, everybody on every party of every view has the right to free speech. But that right does not exist in elections in the workplace. First of all, the employer has the right to hold captive audience meetings, which means they force all employees to go to meetings as often as every day where they have to sit through anti-union propaganda presentations or videos. It is legal for them to require that. There is no right of response for the opposite side. In fact, employers can tell workers who they think are pro-union, you have to come to this meeting and I don't want to hear you say anything. And if you ask a question, you're going to be fired on the spot. And that's completely legal. If we think about this in the context of normal elections, if either the Republican or Democratic Party had the power to say, everybody in America every day has to come to our political meeting where you only hear our side of the story, our spin, and nobody's allowed to present anything else or ask any questions, I don't know if they would do it, but if they did do it, none of us would call that a democratic election. So there are captive meetings, forced attendance meetings. There's also one-sided domination of the media, where within the workplace, which is really like the society in which the election takes place, management is free to have anti-union messages on banners hanging from the rafters, postered, plastered all over the workplace, flat screen videos playing 24/7 in every part of the workplace. And pro-union workers are only allowed to have leaflets in the break room and on break time. So this again is like those countries where the ruling party dominates the media and the opposition can't get on TV, can't get on digital media, can't put up billboards. So we have one-sided domination of the media. What we also have is forced listening, which people don't normally think about. But when you look at what does the First Amendment give us in American democracy, it's the right to free speech, but it's also the right to not have to listen to other people's political speech. So if somebody knocks on your door and says, hey, I want to tell you why I'm running for office and I hope you'll vote for me, you're free to say, I'm not interested, I'm having dinner, I don't want to talk about it, and close your door. But what happens in the workplace is the anti-union consultants, and there's a multi-$100 million a year industry of anti-union consultants who have been hired and used by anti-union employers, including non-union auto employers. What they do is they get everybody's supervisor, the person who is your immediate personal supervisor, and have them come up to you, again, as often as every day, and convey anti-union messages. And you can't say to your supervisor, I don't want to talk about it, or walk away, or look bored, or make huffs of disgust. Any of those is insubordination, and you can be fired for that. So we have in these elections, the way union elections work, on the one hand, no free speech rights for workers, and on the other hand, workers can be forced to listen to anti-union speech, both in the big meetings and every day from their supervisors. So when you look at this, it's in a way, it's surprising that even 50,000 people a year manage to create new unions running through this gauntlet of fear and intimidation. Everything I've described up until now is legal under federal labor law, but there's also a tremendous amount of illegal activity. And the reason that there is because the penalties are so slight. I'm not a lawyer, but this is the only area of civil law that I'm aware of in which there's no fines. Even in other areas of employment law, in health and safety law, or in discrimination law, employers can be fined for breaking the law, but that's not what happens here. If an employer does what is usually the worst thing that can happen, which is somebody's fired for being a union supporter, the maximum penalty that they normally face is they have to hire the worker back and pay them their back pay, what they would have gotten, minus whatever money they went out and made at another job in the meantime. So a normal person, as soon as you're fired, is going to look for another job. If you get another job that pays the same amount as the job you lost, your employer doesn't owe you anything. And for this reason, it's not the rogue employers, it's not the outlier employers, but to almost all employers, it becomes rational to say you can fire 3 people and scare 500 or 1,000 people out of the idea of forming a union, and there's almost no price to it. So for this reason, and this also comes from an EPI report that was published last year, in 41%, over 41% of all elections, employers are charged with violating the law. Employers are charged with illegally firing workers for supporting a union in 1/5 of all elections, and in nearly 30% charged with illegally coercing, threatening, or retaliating against workers for supporting a union. So again, if you think of those countries where the ruling party gets 98% of the vote, and even though they have secret ballot elections, but everybody's afraid to ever wear a button for the opposition or go to an opposition rally because they're afraid they'll get fired, that's the kind of system that we have in NLRB elections in every workplace across the country. So the last thing I want to touch on before turning it over to the other speakers is that there are several different ways that we could move forward in creating a right to choose whether or not people want to create a union in their workplace in a way that is really free and fair and that looks more like the elections we know elsewhere. One is by federal legislation, and there is a bill in Congress now called the Protecting the Right to Organize Act that gets abbreviated as the PRO Act that would make these elections look a lot more like the elections we're normally aware of. There could be action at state legislation. I live in Oregon, and Oregon has passed a law that makes it illegal for employers to force workers into these mandatory one-sided propaganda meetings for anti-union messages. There are also a modest number, but a significant number of employers who have voluntarily said, we know the law gives us the right to run these kind of scorched earth anti-union campaigns, but we don't want to poison relations in the workplace that way. And so we're voluntarily going to sign an agreement that usually says the employer will remain neutral. Say this isn't an employer's issue. It's for the workers to decide, don't they want to form a union? And we're going to stay out of it. And the last thing is, and this is a thing that I think is more significant now maybe than at any other time, is to attach requirements to federal or state funding. We're at a moment when the federal and state governments may be putting several hundred billions of dollars into creating the growth and facilitating the infrastructure for the electric vehicle industry. And it would be reasonable to think for taxpayers to say, if we're going to provide all this money to the industry, we want to make sure that the people who work there are able to choose whether or not to have a union and are able to get for themselves the thing that 58 million people want, which is the right to engage in normal collective bargaining to try to ensure that these are family wage jobs, and to do that without having to run this gauntlet of intimidation or be afraid you're going to get fired for standing up for the right to collective bargaining. So with that, I'll stop here and turn it over to the other speakers, and I'm happy to answer questions later on.
Thanks so much, Gordon. And we are grateful that we have some firsthand experiences from several auto workers who have experienced firsthand what it's like to take steps toward forming a union in today's auto industry. And we're going to start with a brief statement from Robert Hawthorne, who is a Nissan employee in Canton, Mississippi. He was planning to be here live with us. I just want to also note that he made the video on short notice, given that his schedule unexpectedly changed, his work schedule. And, I think it's unavoidable to also acknowledge that this is one of many things that he and other workers wish that they could collectively bargain about. Scheduling and many other issues, but they don't yet have a union, and he's going to talk a little bit about his experience at Nissan. So I'm going to turn it over to our folks who can share the video.
Hello, my name is Steve Cochran. I've worked at Volkswagen in a skilled trade since 2011, and I've been through 3 NLRB elections in the last 8 years. Thank you for a chance to speak here today. There's been a consistent support for the union representation among a large number of Volkswagen workers going back roughly a decade. At Volkswagen, we're excited to start building the new electric vehicles moving forward, but we also like a chance to bargain over pay, benefits, and our rights in the workplace. Unfortunately, we have faced many of the obstacles identified in this report that make it so difficult under this current system for Volkswagen workers and other workers alike to exercise their right to organize without intense interference. While Volkswagen itself did not do many of the most aggressive in-plant tactics we have seen from other companies, we faced incredible opposition from outside groups and local elected officials who waged the same kind of heavy-handed campaign tactics aimed at creating fear and confusion. After weathering these intense campaign tactics, workers voted against unionization in the NLRB elections held in 2014 and 2019. Here are a few examples. In the lead up to the 2014 election, United States Senator Bob Corker played a huge role in the campaign against unionization. Corker extremely vocal against the union and claimed that Volkswagen would not place any future products in the plant if employees voted yes. Volkswagen did not comment on the interference or in any way mitigate the fear created by his comments. After we filed for the election in 2019, Volkswagen invited Tennessee Governor Bill Lee into the plant where he shut down production to allow him to speak at an all-team meeting. He urged the workers to reject the union. Lee said that remaining union-free is beneficial to the economy of Tennessee. In both cases, these elected officials carried out the same basic message aimed at instilling fear that are more typically communicated directly by the company, but the effect was the same. Volkswagen used another classic union avoidance tactic, simply using the court system to avoid bargaining with a group of employees who did successfully vote yes in an election. After a smaller unit of skilled trade workers voted yes in 2015, Volkswagen retained Littler Milson to challenge the results of the election and the bargaining unit itself. They delayed bargaining all the way to the 2019 election. The system that allows these types of tactics with no real consequences should change. As long as these auto companies can resist unionization, With the use of such tactics, they will be free to drive down standards in our pay, benefits, and work conditions. Thank you for your time.
Okay, along with the change in schedule, we also had a slight change in order there. So as you probably noticed, you heard there not from Robert Hawthorne, although we'll hear from him in a second, but that was Steve Cochran, who works for Volkswagen in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And so we can roll with the change in order. I think it'd be great to now hear from Robert. And then Gordon will just provide a few seconds for you to jump in and see how you hear these examples fitting into the research you've done in the rest of the report. So, thanks.
My name is Robert Hawthorne, and I work at the Nissan in Mississippi. I do installation work on the Nissan Frontier and the Titan. I was very active in the organizing campaign, and I did participate in the NLRB 2017 election inside the plant. Before I begin, I do want to thank you all for allowing me to participate in this webinar event. Let me start off by saying this, that Nissan made it perfectly clear, extremely clear, that they wanted the workers to vote against forming a union inside the plant. Now, we did have a lot of workers to sign the unionization cards because we wanted to negotiate things such as fair conditions, fair wages, better health and safety and protection inside the plant. But even with all the cards signed, it was still no match for the anti-union campaign that the company ran against us. Throughout the days of the election, you had management along with representatives of management. They did things, bad things, such as showing videos in loops throughout the whole plant on all the monitors. And these videos were played during our breaks and our lunches, giving out information against forming a union inside the plant. Not only there were videos, management also pulled employees inside of these mass meetings where they discussed things of what could happen if there was a union formed inside of the Nissan plant. And one of the things that they mentioned was that we could lose our benefits. And one of the key benefits that was mentioned that we would lose was the lease car program. Now, this lease car program is very popular amongst the workers. And putting that type of fear inside the workers caused the workers to make a swift change in the voting process. But not only that, Nissan also made it clear that workers like me and anyone else who supported forming a union, that we were only allowed to talk about forming a union in certain places and certain times. But on the other side, Nissan allowed the anti-union campaign, they allowed them to bring this big old box with Vote No t-shirts and pass them out to all the workers inside the plant. Now, these tactics have me really, really worried about the future of the other workers in this country. And I feel that if companies are allowed to continue this strategy, then we are in trouble. Thank you.
Thanks. And I want to welcome Dennis Duran, who was able to join us in person in the webinar today to share his experience with a third automaker. He is a former employee of Tesla. And Dennis, I'm going to turn it over to you for just a 2-minute summary of what you experienced.
Okay. Hi, my name is Dennis Duran. Thanks for having me here today and asking me to share a bit about my own experience. I worked at Tesla for 5 years in the paint shop. And during the part of my time at Tesla, I was active in the efforts to form a union. I wanted a union for my coworkers and myself because I believed that through a union, we could improve our working conditions. I especially wanted a better life for me and my coworkers and also their families. We wanted a more safe environment at my workplace, a fair future for us all. And unfortunately, Tesla is an example of what this report highlights because they actively worked against our organizing efforts. Some of the things my coworkers and I witnessed was Tesla trying to harass and interfere with informational leafleting and threatening workers with discharge for distributing union stickers and leaflets and pamphlets without company approval. Some of their tactics were pretty public, as some of you might remember that Elon Musk threatened us through a tweet. He said we would lose our stocks options if we joined a union. In a recent decision in the NLRB confirmed that Tesla's unlawful attacks against us and our efforts to form our union. For example, the NLRB affirmed that Tesla's illegally terminated my then coworker, Richard Ortiz. Tesla also violated the NLRA by disciplining another one of my coworkers, Jose Morin. Both Jose and Richard were unlawfully interrogated for their vocal union activity and pursuing our health and safety rights. Unfortunately, it took nearly 3 years for the board to make a determination in this case, and Tesla continues to fight that decision in court. By the time the board issued its decision, the damage to our unionization efforts had been done. My experience at Tesla is an example of how union busting interfered in our abilities to gain recognition and collectively bargain, which would help improve the growing EV industry. So basically that sums up everything, I had to deal with there at Tesla.
Thanks so much, Dennis, and
Yeah,
glad
you're
you're
welcome.
able to stick around for the rest of the discussion.
Oh
Really
yeah, for sure.
appreciate you
Yeah. Thank you so much.
being willing to talk about what happened. And Gordon, I'm gonna let you contextualize for 30 seconds, and then we have a terrific panel here to turn to with some additional perspectives and responses to the report.
Thanks. So just a few things briefly. One is we're seeing companies say, with a union, we'd be uncompetitive and have to go out of business, like Nissan and Volkswagen, who are unionized in other countries and are not going out of business or having any economic problems. The second is what people described here is absolutely cookie cutter. There's a multi-$100 million a year industry of union avoidance consultants, and you can read their playbooks. These are things they say to do. There are a huge number of companies that threaten that people will lose their jobs. We know that less than 2% of the time are those threats real or based in reality, but it's very common and it's very scary to people. And I guess the last thing I wanted to touch on is just the intimidation factor. When people decide they want to form a union, everybody's looking around at everybody else and trying to say, do I believe that me and my coworkers have the strength to get together and do something to win a better wage, a better standard of living? When you have these intimidation tactics that people become afraid to stand up for the union inside the workplace. And most people are so sensitive to what our bosses say. If you come in the morning and your boss says good morning instead of good morning, people notice that. Then you think your immediate supervisor is telling you a union is bad and handing out anti-union t-shirts. And if you don't wear one, you're outing yourself as somebody who's going against your supervisor and against what the employer wants. It's heavy intimidation tactics that are designed both to try to make people vote against the union, but also to make them feel like it's futile because people are scared to stand up to the boss. So, and this is the intention, and you can read the playbooks of these consultants, and they say this is the intention.
Yeah, so I want to thank the three workers who joined us for giving us very concrete illustrations, and thanks, Gordon, for contextualizing how common these and the patterns that these same tactics are used over and over again. And I am thrilled now to be turning to the first of our three panelists and respondents. Derek Figures is here with us. He is a Labor and Economic Justice Director at the Sierra Club, where his work broadly focuses on the intersections between environment, clean energy transitions, and workforce development. He has long experience in the labor movement, formerly Associate Director for Government Relations at the American Federation of Teachers and the National AFL-CIO and Florida State AFL-CIO political departments, and long experience as a lobbyist, political activist, and great expertise in labor, employment, workforce development, infrastructure, climate, and civil rights issues. So he's the perfect person to kick off the rest of our discussion. Thanks, Derek, for joining us.
Thanks, Jennifer. On behalf of the Sierra Club, thanks to the workers who spoke, EPI, EARN Network, UAW for this opportunity. Also, thanks to the audience for joining. My name is Derek Figures, Labor and Economic Justice Director at the Sierra Club. At the Sierra Club, our theory of change is that there are intersections between climate, workers' rights, and family-sustaining union jobs. We believe that if done right, the United States can lead on both climate and labor policies. As the labor report alludes, it is no coincidence that the rise in auto manufacturers has concentrated in low union density areas or states. And what's worse is that in the auto sector, these states are concentrated in the South, as you've seen from some of the workers who spoke, where anti-democratic, anti-worker, and oftentimes anti-climate policies are threaded throughout their legislatures with incredible implications for workers and or communities of color. In these states, employers are afforded wide discretion to erect barriers that exploit basic human rights and paths to broader prosperity. And more often than not, these barriers are often accompanied by the vestiges of racism and poverty that have historically and disproportionately impacted Black, brown, and or poor communities. But in order to build back better in a meaningful way for working people and their communities, we must prioritize manufacturing in the United States, similar to what Gordon Lafer raised. That includes high quality union jobs and healthy communities. Next slide, please. So we see this moment as an opportunity, hence the idea of union EV tax credits that Gordon Lafer raised. We think that's a key component, and hopefully it stays in the Build Back Better. We can rewrite a story about an inclusive, clean energy economy that includes everyday working people. But we must prioritize manufacturing in the United States, like I said before, and that has to include high quality union jobs and healthy communities. Next slide, please. But these investments will need to go further. Big investments in expanding public transit, passenger rail, EV manufacturing and charging infrastructures could go a long way in reducing carbon emissions. Transportation from combustion engines is widely known as the largest source of climate pollution. Next slide, please. But the investments need to go further. From Sierra Club's perspective, improving air quality, reducing climate emissions, and securing economic justice go hand in hand. So renewable energy projects and broader energy transitions across sectors can't be built at the expense and health of low income and or communities of color. So we want to be able to consider all communities as we collaborate and put plans together and develop when development projects come to our communities and our states. Some people have mentioned community benefit agreements. Local stakeholder involvement is the key here. Next slide, please. And so I wanted to kind of talk about how I cobbled together some notes from my colleagues internally and externally about what has to happen over the next several years and or months regarding kind of organizing. Unions are very much needed in the Memphis area because of the pattern of low wages, part-time hours, and little to no health benefits. This kind of employment does nothing to boost upward mobility of workers. Rita Harris is one of our Sierra Club board members based in the Memphis area. And she was one of the first people I talked to when I thought about the Ford EV announcement, I think a few weeks ago. And I thought, just kind of looking at some of the activities that are happening in the South that are of importance. And I also thought about the fact that organizing in the South has to happen. So next slide, please. Low hanging fruit is one thing, but organizing that connects all of the pieces together can't be stressed enough. So that includes organizing, disrupting, and organizing more. That also includes eliminating or dismantling systemic racism. It also includes deploying more resources to folks in groups in a region that are actually embedded in the communities that we're trying to support in the South. And we also have to organize differently. And that means being more data-driven, more holistic, and less fly-by-night or dropping in when we do these organizing drives, more distributive and empowering. And also we have to really lean in on progressively based building and communicate strategically across all organizations. Next slide, please. I want us to leave you with some of the resources that I kind of cite regularly when I think about organizing in the South. EARN in the South is one. I did want to share the Sierra Club statement on Build Back Better. Also, Alliance for American Manufacturing, the Chisholm Legacy Project focuses on a lot of just transition and energy transition issues related to communities of color. Union Base is a platform for organizing that's digital. The National Black Worker Center, which is it really focuses on the discrepancies between Black workers and other workers in this country. Georgia Stand Up, Southern Economic Advancement Project, and many others you can see. I would encourage folks who are on watching this video to kind of click on these, or at least look them up and check them out. They're really good organizations or resources that I lean on heavily. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. And I already have lots of questions, but I'll hang on to them for the moment. That was fantastic. And I am thrilled now to turn things over to Cindy Estrada. It's an honor to have you here with us. Cindy is serving her third term as a UAW Vice President, currently heads the Stellantis organizing and women's departments for the UAW International Union. She has extensive experience as an organizer and a contract negotiator, intimate knowledge of what workers face in organizing campaigns, and particularly deep knowledge of the auto industry. So I am going to turn it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jennifer. And, I really want to thank Dennis, Steve, and Robert for really taking the time. I know a couple of them wanted to be here in person, but that how it goes in a union shop, we would have been able to maybe get them some time off to talk about this important discussion, the transition in the auto industry. I'm in a unique position in the assignment that I have because I have Stellantis. For those that don't know who that is, that's formerly Chrysler. And so I have this bargaining assignment where we are looking at how we transition our existing members to make sure that they go to jobs, that are good jobs and honor the standards that they've spent decades in building. But then also the non-union sector, I'm over organizing for EV startups, existing places like Tesla, Toyota, all of these companies that are going to be going into the EV work. So on a daily basis, I have to think about how do we move our existing workers in, and how do we organize the non-union so that we can continue to have these great standards that so many before us in the auto industry built. It's very frustrating because you often hear everyone in the political sort of sphere talking about manufacturing is our way back to the middle class, manufacturing. But the truth is, right now, there are 3 union assembly companies, right? Car companies, to 14 in total. So it's really 3 union to 11 non-union. So when you think about the ability to maintain a standard when there's so much of that industry that is non-union, it's pretty frightening. And it's pretty frightening during this kind of transition, because we want to make sure a just transition means that workers are not going to go down in wages, benefits, and working conditions, but we're going to raise them up, or at least keep them where they are right now. I say, do better. And then how do we do that in a climate where there's so much to what Gordon talked about, right? To what Dennis talked about, to what Robert talked about, to what Derek talked about. How do we look at this through an intersectional lens? Like so many people are going to try and make this a false choice, right? You can already hear it. It's climate or it's jobs. It's climate or it's community. And we have to really push back against that and say, no, it's not. It's climate. We can address climate change. We can make sure that there's equitable jobs, and we can make sure that our community also have community benefits, so that companies, it's not just what happens in those 4 walls with the workers, but how do we make sure that the air that our communities are breathing, where these plants are is safe? How do we make sure there's filtration systems? So all those things, I think it's an exciting time as you sit here. You have the Sierra Club on NERN, we have workers, and everyone coming together, knowing that we're not going to allow them to make that false choice. But we're up against, what Gordon was talking about. If you look at a lot of the industry right now, you'll often hear them say, oh, we don't mind having a union. And these are coming from some of our friends, right? We just want the workers to decide, right? And every time you hear that, I want you to think about what Gordon laid out in his report, because that is really code for, we're not going to fight the union. We're going to let everybody else, as I think it was Steve was talking about in Volkswagen, they didn't run an anti-union campaign per se in their company. They allowed all the politicians and the whole state infrastructure to sort of bombard them and say, hey, if you want a union, that's great. But if you do, you'll probably lose your product. So it's like sort of a false choice, right? Like I can have a union, but I'm going to lose my plant. While that's not true, that was the kind of fear that they put into them. So the other thing we have to think about is it's not just, when I first started organizing, like in 96, it was just the company that was running the campaign. Now, again, it is the whole entire state infrastructure. And so, there's tons of risks here because we could end up transitioning this auto industry into very low wage jobs. Most auto workers out there in the non-union sector are literally working 1, 2, 3 jobs walking into food stamp lines because they're non-union. And so to me, there's no such thing as a good manufacturing job unless you have democracy in the workplace. You can't punch out of democracy just because you punched into a plant, as my husband used to say. But so I think the challenge is the opportunity. The risk is we create low wage jobs and we build back worse instead of build back better. But the opportunity is that we have public support out there right now. As Gordon said, tons of workers want to form a union. More and more policymakers and the public are understanding what workers like Dennis are up against when they try to form a union. And so we are getting more support for things like the PRO Act. We have, all these taxpayer subsidies, right? And a lot of groups, all of us, environmental, racial justice, working together and say, not in our city unless there's these labor standards attached to it. Not enough yet, but you're starting to hear more and more of that. We have workers striking across the country. I say, forget the labor board, let's strike them off for recognition. So maybe this will catch on because that is a legal way to form a union. And then you can bypass everything and get a union quicker, but we also have to educate more policymakers because a lot of people want to say, we're going to build back and these are going to be union jobs. But as Gordon pointed out, the system to get there is broken. And I would say even stronger. It's like corrupt and rigged against workers. And so we have to, this is so important. I want to appreciate the EPI for doing this because I think there's still a lot of people out there that don't know what it's like for a worker like Dennis or Steve, right? Or don't know what it's like, how much when the auto industry went through a crisis, how that impacted Black, brown workers and women workers. And they're still feeling that impact because they haven't completely recovered. So I'm excited though, because I think these opportunities are huge. Just the fact that we're all on the call and saying that we can do all three, we can address climate change, we can address, we can have a sustainable environment, we can have sustainable jobs, and we can have sustainable communities. And if we all stay sort of hooked up like that, when others try and divide us, I think it's possible. And not only possible, I mean, we have to make it happen for the future of our kids. So, again, I'm just excited to be here. And I just want to leave everyone with, when you hear a company say, like the Rivians and the Teslas, who are all these really high road companies and care about the environment, you cannot care about the environment if you don't also care about the environment that workers live, the money they're making, and whether or not they can feed and clothe and send their children to school. And we have to start calling them out on this, that is unacceptable, and that none of us are going to continue to accept that you're a good company without having all of those pieces in place. So thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. And I so appreciate your ability to both be very clear-eyed about the challenges and bring that vision forward for what the opportunities and what the possibilities are before us right now. I am excited to wrap us up by turning things over to our third panelist, Kyle Moore. Kyle Moore is an economist with the Economic Policy Institute program on race, ethnicity, and the economy. He specializes in the intersection of racial economic disparities and health inequity. And I want to say that personally, I'm grateful to have Kyle as a colleague from whom I learn a great deal all the time, and especially grateful to have him weigh in on this discussion today. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Jennifer. Yeah, just to close, I wanted to do some forward looking and forward thinking about the discussion we've had today, and just think more about the evolution of this new industry that we're seeing kind of be birthed through the work of so many people. And I think the electric vehicle industry really exists right now at a bit of a crossroads. Electric vehicles have shades of both the tech industry and the traditional auto industry. And again, it's going through a bit of a crossroads in terms of how to develop its relationship with labor. we've seen the tech industry grow over the past few decades in a way that has been, characteristically ununionized or non-unionized. And a lot of the workers in the tech industry are trying to grow that now ex post. And we have a chance to do things differently. And I think a lot of the lessons that we've seen in the tech industry will show us why it's important that we build this electric vehicle industry with unions at the forefront, right? You may hear, for example, that, tech workers have high wages, but, and that's, first of all, not true across the industry for all workers. But it's also not a substitute for workers having a voice and control in what their working arrangements are. And whether or not they have scheduled work or regularly scheduled work, the hours they have to work in a given day. We also see the tech industry being rife with systems of tiered employment, like contract workers. You have folks working alongside, doing the same sorts of work as their peers, but not receiving access to the same benefits like pay time off, for example. And we've also seen it grow in a way that is highly non-representative across groups, with Black workers and women workers make up a disproportionately low share of that industry, right? And all of these are lessons that I think the electric vehicle industry can learn as something to avoid as it evolves moving forward. But I think a lot of lessons can be learned from the challenges that the auto industry has had and overcame in the development of its union movement, right? And I think when you think about the way that unions have shaped the auto industry, a lot of that is bound up with the history of the civil rights movement. And I think, Dr. Laffer talked a lot about unions as a democratic institution. And I think that they are one of the preeminent democratic institutions in the United States. And, there should really be no separation between the ideas of civil rights and labor rights. I think functionally there isn't. And civil rights advocates have understood for a long time that you can't really have civic freedom without having economic security, right? And that makes union drives, the sorts of work that the workers on the call talked about today, that's just as important as any sort of voter registration campaign that takes place, in the political sphere. And what they're doing is really a continuation of the civil rights movement. Somewhat to Derek's point as well, the places that are most hostile to the development of unions have been the places historically that have been the most hostile to development of civil rights and the expansion of civil rights. These places have tried to weaken the labor movement, and they've also tried to, weaken, people of color's access to political rights, generally speaking. So these two struggles have always been intertwined. It's important to highlight that and important to connect those two struggles, or at least to view those two struggles as connected. And, and now that all that being said, I think one of the points I really wanted to make today was that those two movements are connected. And it's important to highlight that connection because it's important to understand that unions are shaped by the intent of their members and the intent of leadership. And, to Cindy's point, we have to be able to make commitments at the outset as to what decisions we want made for our communities, in addition to, worker conditions and wages and things like that. We know that unions provide a serious wage premium for people of color and women, and they've been better for representation across industries. But again, that doesn't come automatically, right? I think we have to be able to have those conversations and say that we are committed as members of this union to, equal representation across occupations within the industry, to pay promotion and or pay and promotion transparency, to constantly analyzing racial disparities that may exist within the company, right? And so I think once we make those commitments ourselves, that's when you start to see the real change take place. And again, it goes along with, giving workers the latitude to express dissatisfaction with their working conditions, right? A lot of these things are essential to closing racial gaps that may exist within workplaces and solving some of the disparities that exist within communities. And unions can do that, but again, it's important for unions to make those commitments up front. So ultimately, again, the important thing is that we make these commitments at the outset and we make them explicitly, right? Because that's the real way to ensure that unions are doing what we want to do for workers of all groups and also for the communities in which workers are living. And I'll close there.
Thank you. That was such a rich synthesis of so many of the points that have been raised today. And I am scanning through some of the questions that people have asked. I'm going to start with the easy one, which is, yes, there will be a recording of this webinar available after this. It will be on the EPI YouTube channel, and those who are registered through the Zoom system will receive a link to the recording after this. And a related question I think someone had was to the resources and including the list of organizations that Derek mentioned. And yes, we will follow up with an email that includes those links so folks can access them after this. I want to pick up kind of where we left off, and we had a question that picked up on Dennis's comments about experiences at Tesla, and sort of broadening the question to having heard about women whistleblowers who have alleged sexual harassment and unjust firing as Tesla employees. And then I'm going to take the liberty of combining a couple of questions because I know we also had folks in the Q&A bringing up the persistence of hiring discrimination and occupational segregation and the failure of automakers in their hiring practices, particularly in non-union plants that have expanded into the South and other parts of the Midwest, to reflect the demographics of the communities where they're located. And so if I'm pulling a couple of those questions together and just tossing back to the panel, I think the question this person was asking is, what's the overlap with the anti-union efforts of automakers? And is there a way to be in solidarity on these overlapping issues, and what would that look like?
I mean, I'll just jump on and say that, yes, unions are useful for being able to overcome some of these, systematic disparities and, occupational segregation and things like that. I think it just has to be made explicit in the goals of the particular union to say that we're going to prioritize this. And that's what you get when you get worker participation in hiring decisions, in structuring pay ladders, and different conditions of pay and promotion, right? As long as those workers have that commitment to those principles, then that can happen. And it's not necessarily something that happens without unions being in place and without workers being able to speak up and say, hey, this is a problem and we would like to see this changed, right? You need union representation to be able to make that case.
And I would just add, because we're talking about manufacturing in particular, and UAW has, said it for GM, Chrysler, I always say Stellantis. We have a long history of, in terms of, classifications, getting women and people, Black, brown women into skilled trades jobs. We have, are addressing issues constantly. Right now, a union reflects society, right? So whatever you have in society, you're going to have on that shop floor. The difference is that we have a forum and a table we can come to address these problems. It doesn't mean we don't have the problems in our plants, but there's a robust discussion, and with the leadership, right? We can have a discussion. I was just working with our council the other day, and I made them look around. This is the leadership of the Stellantis. Like, look in front of you, look in back of you, look to the side of you. Do you look like your membership, right? And if leadership, we can have those kinds of discussions, and because that's important too in the union leadership, that we reflect and have that representation, whether it be in terms of gender, in terms of race, ethnicity. So you still have the same problems you have in society, but you have a forum to correct them and discuss them and make them better. And you just don't get that in a non-union shop.
I just wanted to add something at the kind of economy-wide level, which is if you look nationally and say, like, what are the key sectors for creating opportunities for the Black middle class? Probably the most important is the public sector, so that any attack on the public sector, whether intended or not, functions also as an attack on the Black middle class. And in the private sector, the auto industry, and particularly the union auto industry, has been another critical pillar of that. 25% of union auto jobs are African-American workers. And so even if we just say, if we're going to see a transition that functions as deunionization and lowering wages and benefits, in addition to everything else it is, this also is something that is eroding one of the key pillars of the Black middle class if we look across economy-wide.
So let me switch us over to a policy question, which may be our last one as I'm watching the time tick away. So we had someone ask about proposed changes dramatically increasing. So Gordon, mentioned the lack of significant penalties for employers who may routinely, and in some cases just adopt it as a business model, violate labor law. As some folks know, there are proposals. This is one tiny piece of the PRO Act, which may or may not be included in other congressional bills. So they're asking, do you think proposals to dramatically increase those fees, those fines, so making a real monetary penalty part of the law, would that be a game changer? How much would that affect employer behavior? And would it curb some of the extreme anti-union tactics that Gordon has documented here?
Well, I'll just say very briefly, I mean, obviously there's a lot of terrible things that happen that are legal under federal labor law and that wouldn't be challenged. But having significantly stiffer penalties would be a very significant step in the right direction. It would curb, the worst kinds of employer behavior. I also think it would encourage more employees coming forward and making complaints, because if you've been mistreated and you think, well, I can file a complaint, but it's not going to do anything, then there's no point in sticking your neck out. If you think it really has the capacity to do something, I think that will also encourage more people to come forward.
I'd like to just say, I think it's a step in the right direction. I know the full breadth of PRO Act is something that I was looking forward to, having worked on it for several years at the American Federation of Teachers on behalf of the private sector, obviously, because teachers represent public sector, but still, I think it is a step in the right direction, similar to what Gordon was suggesting.
I just want to add, I agree, but I think even more, and we should continue to fight for that because that's the right thing to do. But I think when seeing workers stand up and the disruption that Derek talks about, I was, and really standing with workers when they do that, I think the best protection is always going to be those workers acting in concert and then getting in concerted activity and then getting those communities around and the public to stand up. And so I think, we always, and so yes, and both. I don't want to wait for the PRO Act, right?
Right.
And I don't want to cut you off, but there is some precedent for communities, once they learn what the issues are around a strike or something that's a, kind of a worker dispute, they are much more supportive. They may not have been supportive prior to, but having learned about the issues, underlying issues that workers are fighting for sometimes, changes, the context and perspective from those who would typically oppose.
Well, I want to thank you both for ending us on that note, because that was actually one of my first questions that I wanted to ask, and a great one to leave our audience with, which is, what are the roles that everyone has to play in shifting this imbalance of power? And I want to thank Gordon Lafer again and our panelists for their ongoing work and leadership. Special thanks to Robert, Steve, and Dennis for their courageous ongoing organizing efforts, and also for taking the time today to share very vivid examples of why we need policy change. And I want to thank all the attendees who joined us. Today's discussion made clear that there really are roles for all of us to play. Worker exploitation, inequality, and the weak labor laws that make them possible are very deeply rooted in systemic racism, sexism, and imbalances of power that none of us can confront alone, and that we should not expect individual or even large groups of workers to be able to confront alone. We clearly need labor law reform. We also need, to bring it back to the note that Cindy and Derek pointed us to at the end here, expanded commitment to and resources for organizing that empowers workers to turn new jobs into good jobs, strong solidarity from across the spectrum of local communities, and strong solidarity among racial, gender, worker, and climate justice movements, which is what this moment calls for. So I want to thank everybody who contributed to this discussion and your ability to both really open folks' eyes to the daunting challenges before us and also help people envision the world that it may be possible for us to build. Doing both of those things is a challenge, and I think each one of you helped us do that. So everyone who attended will receive the follow-up resources, which I mentioned. You can follow EPI at Economic Policy on social media. Visit epi.org for a link to this report and much more information. So on behalf again of the Economic Policy Institute and their network, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next time. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.